8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Voice of Stockton. For more information on The Voice of Stockton, go to thevoiceofstockton.org.
This is KBCC 89.5 FM, Tracy, California, Peace and Justice Network of San Joaquin.
The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of KXVS The Voice of Stockton or its parents, affiliates, management, and staff.
Radio show.
Kimberly Warmsley.
Radio show. Radio show.
Filling the community one conversation. Good morning, the city of Stockton, San Joaquin. Welcome to the Live with Kimberly show. I am very honored and very privileged to have a very special guest this morning. To the right of me is the assembly person for our community, for this district, assembly person Susan Eggman Talamantes. We are here today to talk about the adverse effect of emotional distress and mental health and how it relates to the community of Stockton. But before we get started, I do have to just really truly and wholeheartedly recognize our assembly person. One, I met her probably about 2008. I was a student at CSU Stanislaus gaining my master's degree in social work. I always knew that school was like my everything. I knew that school was going to be my ability to stabilize my family and get back to the community, but I never knew what I wanted to do. And I remember being in, like, I don't know, I think it was like a social theory class or some sort, and I was just kind of like doing my work, not paying attention. And we started talking about macro practice, which is a social work class that empowers social work to get into social justice and social welfare reform. And so I'm sitting in class, like doing my little assignment or whatever, and walks in. At that time, I think you were running for city council.
It was 2008. I was probably already on the city council.
Okay, she was on the city council. I think that she was like rerunning or just coming to empower the class. And so her conversation was so powerful and so uplifting to me as a social worker student that I just like became conscious about what my destiny and what my purpose was in life. And so I thank you for being an inspiration to social workers like myself, coming up in this community and really trying to give back. Being recently licensed less than a year ago, you continuing to be that inspiration to me in my career, because you are a social worker and you are a LCSW and you have a PhD in Chicano studies. And so just really wanting to give homage to that element of just being a very educated and conscious person in the fight for social justice and how it relates to the community. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And you make it all worthwhile as you continue to carry on the legacy, carry on the work. And I think that's hopefully what we all do, is we all, serve as we can in whatever space we find ourselves in, and then always being able to provide tools and lifelines to the next generation to carry on the work.
Give back. So this morning, we're going to talk about something that is a needed conversation. We are going to talk about the effects of mental health or emotional distress and trauma and what that looks like for our community. We're going to talk a little bit about the homeless epidemic. We're going to talk about grief, loss, and trauma and emotional distress. These are big subject matters. So let's start with homelessness, because that just is resonating with my mind right now. So as everybody knows, homelessness is something that is a concern to every and all persons in our community. Homelessness is such a broad topic because of some of the barriers that homeless persons face, such as inability to access services, inability to be consistent in accessing resources. There's a huge substance dependency and use problem that we're facing. And so let's talk about homelessness and what are some of the things that we can do as a community? What are some things that we need to put in perspective when, formulating policy and ordinances that target our homeless population?
Yeah, I don't know in recent history if we've ever been confronted with a problem of this magnitude. I think some of the issues are very clearly that it's expensive to live in the state of California. A lot of people, people want to live here. We don't have enough housing stock to go around, and so the housing that is available is very high priced. So that cuts into the subsection right there. Even though we've raised minimum wage in the state of California up to $15 an hour,
right?
We're still climbing to hit that mark. But even at that, 2 people making $15 an hour still will qualify as low income.
You're right.
And oftentimes aren't able to afford the housing where they live. So there's an issue with housing. There was just a big bill in the legislature we just all came through Appropriations Week, which means we have all of our ideas that have money attached to them, and they go through this process, and we don't always come out winners. So Scott Wiener out of San Francisco had a bill that would, because one of the issues we have is the issue of NIMBYism, like not in my backyard.
Right.
So we all say we need more housing, and then we say, well, let's build some supported, homeless shelter here, no, not here. So this was a bill that was attempting to say we need to build more density, and we need to be able to kind of go around some of local control. So the League of Cities, a lot of other people who have a lot of investment in local control and how their communities look, they come together and say, no, let's not do that. We'll do it on our own. I spent time up in the Paradise area after their massive fire.
Right.
Massive fire. So the majority of all their housing stock has been wiped out, burned down. So one of the things the communities asked was that, could we do some CEQA reform, and that's the environmental reform, that if everything met the qualifications, could they get easier go-ahead to build? So we were trying to help that to the legislature. And then the city of Chico said, no, we don't want it, because they didn't want to have any more housing than they felt like they could cope with. So it feels right now we're living in this world of scarcity where everybody is buckling down and saying, no, we don't, we all acknowledge there's a problem. And yet when we talk about where do you cite places for homeless people to live, the walls and the barriers start going up.
So that's that not in my backyard theory where we talk about it. However, sometimes there's fear factors that come along with that, because people see, I think that people have a misunderstanding of who homeless people actually are. And so sometimes homeless individuals who are experiencing homeless get the rut of the thing, the rut of the, what am I trying to say? The end of they get the misperception that they are not the ideal person. And so that fear factor, it contributes to barriers to actually implement institutions, facilities, or establishments that can be helpful, because I think that the affordability in housing is a barrier, but also when a person has faced homelessness and or displacement for X amount of time, for a long duration of time, it's traumatic. And so how are we dealing with the trauma of being homeless? I hate to say it, but trauma is so intersectional to almost everything in life. Trauma is intersectional with how we dislike or like our job, how we dislike or like the way that we are living, and so it's problematic. So how are we really shaping the element of making sure that people have access to housing? Because like you were saying, So Chico shut it down. Chico said no. So where are these people going now? And this is a whole city that was basically burnt down. And where are they supposed to go?
About 28,000 people. So they have, there's some in Orville. There's trailers set up, but a lot of the living is very transient. People are staying with relatives. I know there is somebody across the street from me who was staying with a family member who is from the city of Paradise. So there is just there is not enough. And yes, then the trauma accumulates. And when we talk about homelessness, when it's full scope, there's different segments, right? Then you have families, people with children who are, might be a car break away and who might be staying with the family members. In the legislature, we have tried to do a lot with ADUs, or accessory dwelling occupancies.
Right.
So people can, convert a garage or make something in the backyard. So we know there's a lot of that going on. That's a certain segment. And then you have those who face mental health and substance abuse issues. That tends to be a smaller population of the overall homelessness, but those are the ones who are generally the most visible that you see on the street. You see sleeping on the street. You see panhandling on the street. You see people clearly having psychotic episodes. Those are the folks that are much more difficult to be able to get in housing and maintain housing. It tends to be the most expensive part of the demographic as well. We see them in and out of emergency rooms, in and out of jails. And we know our jail and prison system has turned into our biggest mental health serving system, which is a stain, I think, on the state of California and the country in how we go forward in treating those. So I was looking at some statistics. There are currently probably about 150,000 people living on the streets in California. Probably about 43,000 of those, we think, suffer from severe and persistent mental health issues. And then when you look back into 1967, when then Governor Reagan signed the Lanchers-Petrus Act, right?
Right.
So we have something, right, called that people with mental health issues have rights, and we want to maintain that. But there's always a balance, I think, that you really need to look at. And I had my family suffered with an aunt who had severe mental health issues, and her children to this day will say, how is it her right to be able to be, psychotic on the street, to be raped, to be attacked?
Right.
How do you say that's her right? I mean, she was ill. God rest her soul. She's now deceased. But at that time, about 37,000 people were let out of mental hospitals, because at that time people used to be institutionalized, often against their desire. So now we have gone to a place where, unless somebody, a 5150 law, unless somebody is unable to provide food, clothing, and shelter, a danger to themselves or someone else, you can only hold them then against their will for 72 hours. There's a lot of court proceedings to get.
Right.
So there are conversations about, has the pendulum gone too far for people's rights, and is it truly a civil rights issue to be as mentally ill as you want to be and be on the streets? So I think that's a conversation that we will continue to have. I did a bill 2 years ago, I think, and it came from so if somebody has been sentenced in the criminal justice system, then you may be able to give them medication against their will for treatment. For people who are pre-sentenced, they might just be in jail and could be there for a while. There is no treatment available, and so people are often psychotic, hitting their head against the wall, smearing feces. So we carefully, again, you have to carefully craft a law with the ACLU at the table, law enforcement, and mental health workers all to say, how do we make sure they have their rights, but that they're not a danger to themselves, and we can, in a humane way, be able to treat them.
And I think that is such a complicated conversation to have. So I've done, and I still do, medical social work in the hospital. And so you do have an abundance, a significant amount of people who continue to utilize the emergency rooms as a source of treatment. They don't meet the criteria for a 5150 because it is not illegal to be psychotic. It's not illegal to walk around and talk to yourself. It's when you hit the cuff of being gravely disabled that you can be 5150. But a lot of times, caregivers and family members do not understand that.
Very frustrating for family members.
It's very frustrating because they want that now and they want this person to be medicated. However, there are laws that protect them. But there is a fine line to, to the fact that that some people who are suffering from emotional distress are in the community and are at risk. But I also want to talk about the statistics. So statistics are only as good as what is reported and what is able to be counted. And so with that being said, it's very hard to really get a concrete number of how many people are suffering from homelessness and emotional distress, because we have a hard time trying to follow up with these individuals.
And the point of time that when once a year they count, and the numbers I read are from an earlier report, because what I read just this morning was that the point in time counts that are going on right now are showing it just drastically going up. Drastically going up.
Yeah.
And it's right, because when you try to count all the homeless, I mean that is a,
it's a difficult process.
It's a difficult process. If you just conceptualize that, it's difficult.
Absolutely. And so with that being said, the continuum of care continues to be a barrier. So if our homeless individuals do not have access to phones or addresses, like how do we keep a close, observation of their lifestyles in order to provide that service or that outlet? And I think that these conversations do need to be had about what strategies need to be in place to ensure that people have the supportive services, because I think that getting them the affordable housing is only a piece of the process, but the services and providing the services in a culturally appropriate and person-centered means is necessary. When someone has experienced displacement, it's a very sensitive topic for them. And so how are we providing that service? Again, not going in to tell them what they need to do or what they should do, but starting at a point of listening, because we can understand a person more if we take time to listen and understand some of the things that they are going through. And so, I mean, the conversation is so big. It's so big. But I hope that as we continue to address homelessness and emotional distress and substance abuse, that we are looking at the holistic approach of everything that person has gone through, and incorporating some type of logic and solution in order to solve this. Yeah,
and we are a big dynamic state, almost 40 million strong, which is, we're a nation state. So in, I think it was 1997, we started going towards realignment, where we said counties should be providing more direct care than the state. Just because, Del Norte County, way up in Northern California, is very different from LA County.
Absolutely.
Different from, San Francisco, different from San Joaquin, with different issues and different demographics. So in 2000, that we started shifting it to the counties, and then in 2004 is when the Mental Health Services Treatment Act was passed, where we started charging $1 million tax, or a 1 cent tax on millionaires to fund mental health treatment. So all that money has shifted down to the county. So every county is supposed to come up with their own plans. We have had some conversations at the state of recent. Is that money being used most effectively? Because a lot of it was designed to be used for prevention on the front end side, but clearly right now we have an intervention crisis on the back end side.
Big time. So,
you can't take your eye off trying to prevent issues, and we know one of the biggest growing populations of people with mental health issues are young, under 25 now. We know suicide is continuing to increase. So we can't take our eye off that ball, but at the same time, when you have chronically and persistently mental health patients who are living on the streets, that's a crisis that we also need to solve.
Absolutely. And I just think that, unfortunately, I think that the issues are so convoluted that it is very hard and very difficult to prioritize what is the most important or what's a crisis at that time, because the preventative is definitely something that is needed. And with the MHSA, the Mental Health Service Act funding, I know that a piece of it that I really, really like is that it really targets sub-communities or subcultures to provide that culturally enriched element, because we do understand that some cultures need a little more support because of mistrust. So in order, I mean, that's the number one rule as a LCSW, rapport is everything, because if you don't have that rapport and relationships with those communities and they trust you, then I don't care how many times you knock on the door, they're going to tell you to fly a kite. So we need to be having those conversations and building trust in communities that are disinvested. And I do want to say this, that a disinvested community does not necessarily have to be a community that's impoverished.
No.
Because the investment in communities is making sure that they have access to health care, to mental health, to resources to be successful. There's a story that kind of broke my heart this morning of a transgender woman in, I think it was Dallas, who had faced bullying, ridicule. She was assaulted numerous times in the last year or so. In Dallas, and I think that Dallas in the state of Texas probably isn't the most culturally sensitive state, I will say. And this morning, she was found on the streets, deceased. And, I saw that story, and I immediately just started reading stories and articles about how often this happens in the LGBT community. And something that resonated with me, I read, was that the LGBT community is amongst the highest population in the United States that are facing trauma, bullying, and suicide at this time. And so, interestingly to me, no one's talking about this. And so, hey, that's a whole premise of Live with Kimberly. We're going to talk about it. The LGBT community and the shaming and the bullying that is constant is driving the LGBT community over the top in terms of suicidality and trauma. And this is part of the cultures and communities that are less likely to access services because of shaming and because of insensitivity. And so how can we address this travesty? I know that this situation with the transgender woman in Texas happened in Texas. However, a social injustice anywhere is a threat to social justice everywhere. Martin Luther King spoke highly of that. How do we prevent those type of situations happening here in California, and particularly here in Stockton?
Well, I think partly what you're doing right now is having the conversation, to being able to talk about it. There are so many LGBTQ young people, older people who have had the experience of going to a provider and not feeling understood, or going to a provider and having that provider just assume that they were a straight person. And then there comes that, do I want to come out to the dentist, right? Do I want to come out to this? Do I want to come out to every single person? And we know that, especially for the trans community, those things are even more compounded when they're trying to find treatment and care, that there's not oftentimes a lot of sensitivity. And the LGBTQ community also deals sometimes with that issue from their own families. So if you're a person of color, right, you come from a family of people of color, right? So you have a shared experience. In the LGBTQ community, somebody can often, you come from a loving family, but you feel different. And then, whether it's because of cultural issues or religious issues, you are rejected, you are teased, you're told to be that you're wrong, you are thrown out. We know a lot of kids living on the street oftentimes are transgender or LGBT, and the families just don't want them and throw them out. So you have the compounded issue of, coming from another minority community, that you have family support and shared experience coming from LGBT, you could sometimes have compounded, like you're a person of color and you're LGBTQ and,
Right.
something else.
Right.
So
Complex.
So you begin then to not have that same identity with your own family.
Right.
Which just compounds the issue of isolation.
Exactly.
Is isolation, which then oftentimes leads to trauma.
And what's so interesting about this topic is, so the more that a person internalizes that trauma and that sense of loneliness and isolation, that intensifies emotional distress.
And then people tend to self-medicate. So
And then
they're-
people self-medicate, right? And it's problematic. And I think that another conversation to be had is, as providers, how are we ensuring that we are checking our own biases when we are providing treatment to communities? The LGBTQA community, African American community, the Hispanic community, the Southeast.
API.
Oh,
Yeah, API.
Southeast Asian is a huge. It's a population that is so silent in their suffering emotionally. Again, providing outlets and safe spaces for people to heal is something that we really need to improve and increase opportunities. I know I have a little small private practice. I do free services on Friday, just to have conversations and provide those safe spaces for people to come. But again, if we're not having these conversations, then we are a part of the issue. So let's be part of the solution and part of the opportunities for change. And we need to continue the trends. So setting the trends into providing safe spaces to heal, culturally appropriate places to heal, and empathy and sympathy for individuals who may be suffering. Because at this point, I feel like everybody's a check away from being homeless. I'm telling you. My
It's
struggle's been real.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, get a flat tire, a healthcare issue. We
Oh
know
my
those things,
God.
and again, that anxiety.
Yes.
Then that trickles down to our kids, and then that trickles down into the classroom.
Generational trauma is so real. Any last thoughts?
Oh, it's been great talking to you. I hope I get to come back another time.
Absolutely. It was wonderful. I mean, I know this was like a really informative, 20 minutes of real concrete conversations. This isn't the last. We thank you for all the work that you do in Sacramento. And most importantly, thank you for setting the trends for women and social workers,
There we
because we
go.
are needed.
That's right.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in live with Kimberly. We'll see you next week for another hot topic. Enjoy your weekends. And remember that the Voices San Joaquin is a nonprofit. If you would like to donate, please do so. We're always looking for donations to continue to bring this platform to the community. Thank you, everybody. Have a good Monday. Bye-bye. I am